Move.
Are these all agreements under the discounted? Because we're getting quite late in the piece now, so are these the...
No, none of, through Mr Chairman, none of these attract the discount. These are all outside the discount.
So we're actually getting, outside that period, we're still getting...
A number
of...
Yeah, interest rates are still low, so people, it's still attractive to them to do this.
And which is the Esplanade strip, Mr Chairman?
It's a grazing margin, or was it an ex-grazing margin around the margins of Lake Runanga, and the landowner there has retired that and in exchange has a RLS grant for fencing and riparian.
Councillor Dick.
I can just make a comment carefully, discreetly. If freeholding continues on at this rate, then they'll all be freeholded within 12 years.
Very discreet. Moved, seconded. Any other questions before we go to the recommendation? Wish to speak? No further speakers. I'll put that motion. Then all those in favour, please say aye. Contrary, no. Carried. Right. Item 9. HBRC Board of Directors perceived conflict of interest on page 9.
Excuse me, Mr Chair.
Yes.
Is it appropriate that the Council of Directors vote on this item when it affects them directly?
Yes, it is.
Why is that, Mr Chair?
Well, because it's appropriate. Now,
Mr Chairman, perhaps we could get Mr Webster up.
Mr Webster is not here for his smoko break, I'm sure. Would you care to join us?
Mr Chairman, if I could just perhaps respond to Councillor Reynolds-Wild's statement. I mean, there is no recommendation from HBRC to be considered in this paper, so there's no certainly no element of predetermination of any outcome. And the conflict of interest issue is anticipating some future event, in other words, a decision around the potential investment in the storage for Ruataniwha, so it doesn't exist at the moment.
Thank you, Mr Chair. It was a question, and I realise there's no compulsion on the directors to not, that is an option that they have, given that it's related.
Oh, we understand that, Councillor. No point of order needed. Right, let's move into the paper.
Right. Do you want to look? I'll just do a very quick 2 minutes on the paper. At your last council meeting, you or the council considered the paper from HBRC Limited with a number of suggestions as to how to potentially manage the potential conflict of interest and predetermination issues. In addition, there was legal advice provided from Mr Webster, and the resulting resolution was that council determined that action did need to be taken to reduce the perception of conflict of interest, and asked that a report come back to this council meeting around what some of those or what those options may be, and particularly looking at the pros and cons of those and the potential costs involved. So this paper really just sets out the relevant parts of the Constitution, the HBRC Constitution as it stands, goes through a number of options, and I'm not going to go through each of those because I'm sure you've read them all in some detail. And really, I guess the conclusion that it comes to is that that there are still a couple of options for your decision making, really around whether or not. And it's really contingent on whether or not the council believes that it needs to take action now to look at the perception of conflict of interest, or whether or not the council considers that that's actually a matter of business for the incoming council to determine. And so the recommendation is premised on whether or not you consider that it's appropriate to take the action now, or that the new council considers it in a couple of months' time. And I'll hand over to Mr Webster to actually answer any questions or comment or answer any questions around some of the specifics in the paper itself.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, councillors. This paper is really a joint effort with Ms. Lambert, Chief Executive, where 6 separate options were identified and then a pros and cons analysis was conducted on each of those. The important point about that Councillor Remsveld mentioned is actually addressed in paragraph 3 and was a question that was addressed to me by Ms. Lambert, and I indicated to her that I did not think that there was a conflict of interest in any of the current councillor directors deliberating and voting on this particular matter.
Sorry, just to interrupt you there, Stuart. That is not paragraph 3. There's a different. That's an earlier version.
Oh, sorry. I'm working off a paper that I understood to be the final one. I didn't get the final. Right. Okay. Fine. Anyway, that question's been answered. So I'm in a position now to answer any queries that any of the councillors might have.
Mr. Curtin.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
There we go. Right.
Mr. Webster.
We're all current. Right,
Mr. Webster. In coming to your conclusion about conflict of interest, can you just walk the council through the references you made, considerations made, or alternative advice received, or second opinions received in coming to a conclusion that there was no conflict of interest?
This matter had its genesis about 2 months ago, and I prepared a paper and an opinion which was tabled and formed part of a recommendation paper that came up from the officers last time, and that details, I believe, the reference material that I have looked at in coming to my conclusions. That it's a legal opinion. There's a mix, of course, of legal and political issues in all of this, and we're dealing here with, I think, perceptions. And I said right at the outset that I believe that doing nothing was an option, and that is one of the options, number 6 on the list, I hope. And that letter is footnoted with references to certain cases, and Councillor Douglas asked me some interesting questions about the Dunedin City Council case and the Hamilton Casino matter as well. So that's the foundation for the opinion to Council. I might say that there is reference also to the Office of the Auditor General, and it's fair to say that that matter hasn't been looked at in any detail except in the sense of pecuniary interests. Hasn't been looked at in any detail by that office since about 2004.
Mr. Chairman, just in regard to, did you seek? Did you say you contacted the Office of the Auditor General?
No, there's a series of reports that have directly addressed the question of conflicts of interest in a non-pecuniary context, and it's in relation to holding companies of local authorities.
Mr. Chairman, in respect to the Auditor General, the report refers to, and I'm on page 10 of the agenda under paragraph 11.1, and it appears in several other places, and it says the benefits of appointing councillors to boards of directors identified by the Office of Auditor General in 94. Can somebody confirm or otherwise my memory of that, which is about appointment of councillors to holding companies as opposed to operating companies?
If I can answer that question, we traversed this last time, and I said to you I did not think it made any difference in my view that we were dealing with an operational company or a holding company, That particular issue hasn't been dealt with, I don't believe, by the Auditor General's office.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, can I then ask the question very specifically? And I thank you for your opinion. It wasn't your opinion I was seeking. It was whether the Auditor General, and I know you referenced this right at the end, the Auditor General recommended links to from councils to holding companies as advantageous.
Correct.
My memory says the Auditor General said councillors, however, shouldn't be on operating companies.
I don't believe that that's what the Auditor General's office has said. I think that there is simply no comment on that. That particular question hasn't been directed to the Auditor General.
Sorry, my question, not a comment.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Webster, this questions around the option which runs from 12 to 14.5. It seems to me that this is a cumbersome way of dealing with the issue we have in front of us. Is there any precedent for such a vehicle, or is this something that is coming up for discussion for the first time?
It hasn't come up in my research.
No. So there's no other council or company in the country who's adopted this method?
I think it's fair to say there's a real dearth of precedent or jurisprudence in and around this particular issue. There's certainly plenty of stuff around pecuniary interests, and that really has, I think, taxed the Auditor General's office. But in relation to a straight conflicts of interest and a perception of that, I haven't come across that as a particular option that's been suggested as a way of dealing with the issue.
Thank you.
Councillor Gilbertson.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, I did miss the last council meeting. I think this was brought up, but just on the conflict of interest question, at one stage it was mooted that the council of directors it was such a huge job that it was mooted that they did get paid a salary. This was some time ago, a few months ago, and it was never it was just put through council as an option, and it was rejected because the constitution says no. But so there is an idea floating around there that council of directors, it has been mooted that they be paid. So how do you cover off the thought that there might be, if I got on the thing, I might at some future, there's a reasonable chance I'll get paid. So is there not? How do you cover off that as a conflict of interest? Because sure, it's not in the immediate, but it's a potential expectation. So you're saying that potential expectation that, for example, I get re-elected and I get on the board and I get $35,000 because the council decides we should be paid. You're saying there's no conflict of interest because there's no immediate action. Is that how you cover that off? Because it seems to me that
Well, let him answer the question.
Well, I'm just trying to clarify it. So it's
I believe that's a separate issue for council and is the subject of a separate paper.
Right.
I can tell you that the Auditor General's office has been concerned in the past with council directors being paid market rates as opposed to simply receiving a meeting fee.
So what's your view as opposed to the Auditor General's on that issue?
I'm not sure it's a legal question. I think it does, from a pecuniary interest point of view, creates an expectation and could potentially lead to a conflict of interest.
Councillor Dick.
But Mr. Chairman, the answer to that is that, and I'm reluctant to speak for you and my other colleague, but my understanding has been that the three councillor directors have categorically said they do not wish to be paid.
It's in the Constitution, first and foremost. More questions. Councillor McGregor.
Chairman, my question is generic. It relates to the definition of perception, which is emphasised in point 6 on the first page, and perception as opposed to actual conflict of interest. It's often said that perception is reality, and it may be politically, but surely the reality is indeed reality. And if there's clearly no conflict of interest, perception becomes, whether it's there or not, becomes irrelevant. It's a bit like beauty, it's in the eyes of the beholder. So what was a legal position where you've got a perception of conflict of interest, but there is none?
Can I carry the metaphor on it? This is 50 Shades of Grey. This is political territory, not legal territory.
Councillor Remersville.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Webster, when you've preparing this paper, did you look at the governance review by Warren Larson on the Dunedin City Council, which he recommended that elected councillors should not hold directorships on council-owned companies?
It's correct to say that this is an officer's paper, so I didn't author this. I had input into it. The answer to your question is no, I did not look at that.
So you're not aware of that? That report?
Unless it was mentioned in the paper from HBRC itself.
It's mentioned in the following item after this.
I haven't got the briefing papers, so I'm certainly happy to look at it. The answer is I haven't.
Yeah. Secondly, Mr. Chair, in relation to point 8 and 8.3 and 8.4, which is that the avoidance of risk that council directors of HBRC could be deemed to have predetermined their position on the dam, and also before that the chairman is available to lead the council through significant decision-making process. Does lead the council imply that the chairman has already taken a position or is leading the council in a certain direction?
Not at all. That's, unless Ms Lambert wants to respond to that, it was meant to say that there is a chair of council, and on one of these scenarios, if, for example, the chairperson was the council member who was entitled to remain on the HBRC board, then that would necessarily constrain the chair from, in fact, leading the discussion. And leading is in the sense of directing the meeting, not necessarily having a particular view.
But a deputy could equally do that leading?
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
Lastly, Mr. Chair, in relation to 21, 22, 23, which is one of the other options that we can look at, which is that the council directors remain on the board but just abstain for voting in relation to dam issues. And there's 3 pros for that one and 1 con that's listed. But it is another way of stepping through this problem, which isn't going to be costly, doesn't require any changes to Constitution, and addresses those perceptions of conflict of interest. And as we all know, conflict of interest does encompass perception as well.
Your question, Councillor?
Reality. So this option would be.
So the question
a third
is.
Option would be
Well, we
good
realise
way
that.
of-
What is the question, Councillor?
I'm asking Mr. Webster if this third option would also be a neat and tidy way of dealing with this issue.
Neat and ineffective.
It's got less cons than others, but yeah, that's an assessment for the councillors. I'm really not in a position, except to say that this is a natural consequence of it. You're going to water down the decision-making process around this table to 6 instead of 9. That might be a big con in terms of weighting. WEIHTING.
No further questions, Councillor